Right. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to this week's edition of Imperial as One's Belonging series, where we explore the lived experiences of individuals from the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities. Individuals who have taken the time to share their experiences of how they've gained their sense of identity and their sense of belonging. And I say this every week, and I've never been proved wrong. We've got an extra special guest this week. And our guest this week is Christina Peake. And she is a Bayesian British transdisciplinary artist. She's a PhD student at the University of Westminster and the National Archives. And she's also the curator or the artist in resident at a new exhibition which is going to be held at Imperial called Connect Creative Connections, which will be at the end of February. So this is a unplugged this is a plug for it. So we'll send the information later. But Christina, I'm gonna kick off by asking you that first question, which is, can you tell me what it is or what it was that gave or gives you your sense gave you your sense of identity and your sense of belonging as you were growing up?
Um, so for me, I think that came from having my mother is Bayesian or Barbadian, but you'd say Bayesian, and my father was British, English, and I think it came from having two parents, well, grown up in two worlds really. So my mother, was very, very emphatic on knowing where we came from in terms of our Asian heritage. I was born in the early 80s, so growing up, in the UK, you have, seen around, all the different problems and different experiences when it came to, say, for example, racism, a lot of the challenges that um, the Black Caribbean community had. And, my mum, we were part of a massive kind of Caribbean community. My mum used to work for the Barbados High Commission when she first came over to the UK in like 79. And I think my father was heavily into cricket. It's one of the reasons one of the reasons he ended up meeting my mother is because he went to Barbados because he wanted to see where the best kind of cricketers in
Cricket.
the world came from, which is the West Indies, right? So
Yeah.
he went to Barbados to go see them, and that's where he met my mother. But he was a member of like so many different cricket clubs, and one of them in particular was like, say, the Barbados High Commission Cricket Club and stuff. So you had people from all over the Caribbean, but also I would say going back, so I think that whole Windrush generation was the kind of people that my mum were friends with. So some of them actually had come over in like 1948, like early 1950s and things. So I grew up in this big Caribbean community from all over the islands. And, at that time, people didn't, weren't really welcome in terms of like, clubs and stuff and nightlife. So, my parents were one of many in the community and their friends that would have like the Friday night parties, and all the kids are upstairs and all the parents are downstairs, and you've got like plenty of lots of like kind of like soca and calypso and reggae and all these kind of things. So I've got a lot of memories of just like bass lines and like, you know what I mean? That scent of like rum in the air kind of thing. But she was very emphatic about knowing where you came from. So, when we would go to Barbados, every year or sometimes 2 or 3 times a year, it was because she was like, this isn't a holiday for you. This isn't like the kind of tourist kind of posters or adverts that you see on TV. This is where we come from. This is where people come from.
Mhm.
So this needs to be, foundational in terms of your identity. And I think also, from early age, I'd say probably like 5, 6 years old from primary school, racism was a common aspect of life. So I think the other part of that was, if you're rooted and grounded within your identity, within where you come from, and you have a sense of pride and passion, and you're embedded in that, if you're indigenized in that, then these things kind of insulate you from that,
Mhm.
because then you have something to hold on to. So when you have these kind of like, whether it's racial slurs or anything else, those things aren't true. That people have a
Yeah.
culture, they have a history where you come from. And Barbados to me growing up was like, my family and everything there, it was like bombastic. Like, my grandmother, I think, was almost kind of like supernatural in my head. So, very, very kind of like, colonial Caribbean kind of like, you know, upbringing and stuff when it comes to my family. So my mum was born in 56. So Barbados didn't get independence till 1966.
Mhm.
So when it came to that, it was just like, you had this kind of intense kind of Caribbean kind of atmosphere, and you're in the kind of, we went, my mum's family, would be classed as relatively poor by our understanding. So, when you're growing up with Gran and, with, when she's like skinning sugarcane and like reading you Bible stories, but then she links her like Christianity, like a very heavy environmental kind of reading of it. So she was just like, the natural world is like the greatest kind of depiction of God, really, of the divine. And therefore, really anything that you have to be scared of is going to come in terms of a human aspect. So nature was a massive part of that. And then you also had the kind of Caribbean kind of folklore and sensibilities, and obviously that kind of comes from its kind of African roots as well. So it was just a very kind of like, like color, sound, everything's like, vibrant and bright and heavy and like and very sensuous, I would say, and sensory. So you get immersed in that. And then, on the other side, on my dad's side, the British side, you have very kind of upper middle class kind of family, red brick Victorian house in the countryside down in Sussex, and you got like an acre of woodland, and you're running around and stuff, and it's it's all like the China's been in the family for like 300 years, and it's just they're just complete kind of this extreme differences and in the world as well, and also the social conventions of how those worlds worked as well. So it was quite, it was always kind of going from one place to the other, and there were those different kind of sensibilities. I think with my father's side, sometimes, it almost feels like quite Victorian, it's that kind of look but don't touch, everything's kind of like valuable, and you were very kind of restricted. So out in nature and playing in the woods and stuff was the place where, you felt that you could be a kid and you're running around for hours. And then in Barbados, it was the same thing. Except family was extremely kind of warm and like loving and physical, and but then you're growing up and you're on the beaches and the gullies, which are like these kind of almost like crevasses into the earth that like have rainforests coming out of them. And so and the sound at night of like whistling frogs and things. So I think these places collectively built that sense of belonging, but this sense of like very kind of different kind of worlds. And I think it's one of the greatest gifts that I was giving actually in my life, is growing up within two different worlds, because you understand
Mhm.
what wealth looks like in different ways. You understand what poverty looks like in different ways. You understand what culture looks like in different ways. You understand that there's differences, that your world, if you're living within two, you know that your world isn't the kind of the monolith. It's not the only one that's there. So
Yeah.
from when you're born, you're constantly kind of, you know, moving between worlds and weighing them and comparing them, and then your sensibilities and your values and your way in which you see a world is tempered, because there's two worlds that you're engaging with and that you're living within. So I think it's very different in that context. And I think that fascination and that those experiences, and I've always been going to Barbados since I was a baby, since I was like 6 months old, same with my siblings. So I think that then generated just a natural, I think, an interest, not just in the natural world, but also in culture and people's and places as well. So then I'm, fascinated by kind of like traveling to different places. It's a big part of my work, is, projects not just in, say, in the UK, but internationally. So whether that's been in the Peruvian Amazon, for example, or in Sierra Leone, or as well in the Caribbean. So I think it just was the conception for this kind of hunger for kind of adventure and exploring the world. And I think as well, if you, for me anyway, I found from having that, the evolution of self, I think, is continued as well, because obviously these worlds aren't, they're not in stasis. So
Yeah.
obviously, as like, the UK's changing, society's changing, in Barbados, that world's changing, and everyone else is changing around you. So I think that those comparative sensibilities are constantly evolving with you as well as a person, and it becomes more sophisticated as you kind of temper that and evolve who you are. So yeah, I think that's where it was heavily rooted. Yeah.
It's I find it really fascinating and incredibly interesting what you've said about the contrasting worlds which you inhabited as a child, which
Mm,
which gave you the perspective, a perspective which many people, if they're only found or they're only located in one environment, as it were,
mm,
they're missing out on, or their perceptions of the world are much more blinkered. and it wasn't just on the cultural elements which you spoke about, but you also spoke about the wealth discrepancies as well and the impacts that they also have. So
Mm,
so thinking about that, one of the themes which seemed to be very resonant as you were describing it was this theme about the natural world, right? As whether or not you were in Barbados or you were playing in
mm,
the grounds of your grandma's land, it was always a connection with the natural world, or
mm.
one of the elements which you described. How was that always the case? So like when you were going through school, did you find solace within the natural world? Where did you find your place, as it were?
I think it's because, because obviously growing up within these different worlds, your access is quite rare that you're someone that's grown up in inner city London, but
Hmm.
actually you have access regularly to the countryside and
Hmm.
exploring that. So when people talk about, British food being awful, I didn't really understand what they were talking about because, well, my mum was always cooking Caribbean food. I mean, like Sunday roast was never Sunday roast. It was always like, jerked Sunday roast, or do you know what I mean? Like there was always something happening with it. But like my grandmother, I mean, she'd cook loads of like game and everything was fresh and she had like a kitchen garden and orchard and different things. So everything was just this incredible kind of, stunning kind of like breadth of like kind of like British kind of, you know, um culinary kind of cooking really, and and a very kind of traditional sense of it as well, so probably growing up as one of the few people like in when I've grown up in in inner city like kind of London, because I grew up in like Shepherd's Bush and stuff, and then moved to Uxbridge later when my father was doing better in his businesses and stuff. But it was, I mean, but when you're eating like rabbit and like pheasant and stuff and venison, as well as your normal kind of like lamb and stuff. So I think that I think food can be a huge part of that in terms of the natural world, because it's not just in terms of like sustenance, but it's the way in which families kind of engage and you are with each other. But I think when you're growing up in those kind of worlds from early, you don't necessarily know any different. And I think when you have those kind of spaces, I mean, there's nothing more remarkable for the imagination. Like when you're on a beach, like the beaches in Barbados, and you've got these stunning coral reefs, and the water is literally crystal clear. It is how it looks like in the tourist adverts. So it's just like, your imagination as a child, it's just so kind of overwhelming, and you can go in any kind of direction, and especially with kind of the rich kind of Caribbean kind of folklore and things that you have as well, like whether whether those are things like and spiritual faiths as well, so whether that's Obio, or whether if you're Haitian, whether that's kind of, say for example, voodoo or Santeria or whatever it is. These things are very much kind of there. Sometimes they're spoken of undercover because of the kind of the kind of colonial histories that you have, but and how they were suppressed and things. But those kind of belief systems all linking and merging in with one another, and then how they live with the natural world. It's like, to me, and from the way my grandmother kind of taught me as well, they all kind of interlink. So this idea that my grandmother had of the natural world being divine, and then that's your playground, and it's accessible for anyone. Anyone can go down to the beach, anyone can, like, well, if you can get to them, if you're in London,
Yeah.
maybe, you can run in the woods and you can make all kinds of like stories in your head. So I think that just became very rooted, is like there was no greater kind of living sense of the embodiment of imagination that you could literally play within than it was like the kind of natural world. And
Mm.
again, like as I said, like with coral reefs, when you're seeing like underwater worlds, or when you're seeing as well. And I think something as well is I said before, like the very sensory and sensuous kind of nature of it. So like like flowers scents will change from like day to like nighttime, you know what I mean,
Mhm.
sometimes. Or again, like the sounds of the night as well that you have, say, when you're in Barbados, or and how that adds to things like when you are having stories told, or when you have this kind of really intense kind of atmospheric kind of feeling about it, or that's how it inscribed itself in my imagination. And I think the same thing as Britain as well. Britain has a long history of this sense of of the natural world, and where it's been an indigenous kind of thought and belief systems and things. So I think that's been absolutely key. And I know now, obviously with the kind of environmental and climate kind of crises that we have and stuff, I think, you know, a lot of the dialogue around those now is that, kind of environmental climate justice goes hand in hand with social justice. So the kind of interest and the way in which I was taught about um, the histories that I learned in my community, because my mother was very adamant, that the British school system was not fit for purpose for teaching you and
Hmm.
giving you an education, because it only told one side of the story. Therefore, when we were in the Caribbean, she would teach us the other side. So you also grow up with knowing that there's multiple facets of truth, and how it's presented in history is a classic example of that, of how we read our histories and how it fits into national identity. So I think that was an absolute kind of key kind of premise as well. Is let me just type that in there. Is
You okay?
yeah, it's just the battery, but just put it in the charger. No, it's just so I think that's a key aspect of it, is the natural world. And then you see how that also I think that also reflects a lot of on how people are, who has access to specific places, how they're treated within them. So for example, I think, one of the things that I grew up seeing was how tourists were very much privileged above, especially like local, like Black Bajans and stuff. You see very many islands across the Caribbean where, you know, private access because of hotels means that people can't get to the beaches. But Barbados, all its beaches are public, which is actually quite
Hmm.
a rarity in some cases. So I think the way in which you see people having access to natural spaces, I think there's also, like, like in the UK as well, there's a clear correlation between, like, say, what would be kind of the economics of an area and how their green spaces are maintained. So I just think it's imagination, and it's the perfect playground as a child, and I also think as an adult. But I also think it's a space where you see society acted out as well, and in its care or lack thereof, or what it means in terms of people's belief systems. And I've seen that play out in other places, like when I worked in Freetown in Sierra Leone with an NGO out there, or in the Peruvian Amazon when I was doing residency with indigenous communities. You see how people's belief systems are integral to the environments that they're within, and what that means for them. So yeah, I think it plays out quite a lot in childhood, but also in adult imagination and faith as well.
That's there's a lot of connections that you made there, right?
Mm,
I'm gonna because of that whole idea about can the way the natural world. 'Cause some people just walk straight by. You walk on by, you don't recognize how your interaction with the natural world is impacting on other people's perceptions of the natural world. But I think the way that you've mirrored and married that between the Caribbean and the UK and the other places which you visited, that
mm,
is the natural world was here before we were, and it will be here after we've gone.
mm,
Yeah. Um, and it sounds to me you have a vibrant respect for the natural world and understanding how that natural world impinges upon us as individuals going forward. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's kind of like,
no, I know. I think that's massively the case. But I think it's. I mean, I think it's something that, you're always trying to do well, trying to do better with. Do you know what I mean? I do find
Mhm,
quite a lot of things, so, people in places can get priced out of what's organic and what's
mhm,
ecological, and different things. But I think in I think in general, yeah, it's a part of who you are. And I think over the years, with different projects that I've done, I've seen
mhm,
different communities and different societies seen, as I said, maybe through their belief system, so they engage with the natural world. But I also think you also see, I remember, so when I did the residency in the Peruvian Amazon, it was about close to 2 months, because I added on like a bit of traveling and things as well through Peru.
mhm,
And you're seeing people's, like, Amazonian kind of belief systems, do you know what I mean, in terms of ideas of, like, of ancestors and spirits and origin stories, where key
mhm,
creatures are those. So for example, like the anaconda was the kind of key kind of deity for the Kukama community that I was with
mhm,
mostly during that time. And their story was that Kukama, the sorry, the anaconda came down the river and she looked onto the side of the bank and she saw this man and she fell in love with him. So she transformed herself into a human to come to be with him. And their first child was the first kakama, and obviously, something like the Amazon, I mean, like, Christ, I've never been somewhere where like it's like you can't see anything, but the entire place is filled with life, and you're just like, oh my God. And I think that's another thing with the natural world. It's not romanticizing it. I think if ever you want to feel like you're not at the top of the food chain, it's when you go into specific environments and then you very are aware of yourself as being prey. I think that's a very it's a very kind of very quick way of understanding that you're not at the top of the food chain when you're not in your element, what I mean, if being tracked by jaguars or if you're in the sea, and you're swimming with sharks or whatever. But I remember at the end of that, having this feeling when I was doing international projects that I could only go so long, things like funding and different things and work. And then I came back, I was like, I want to do something long term.
Mhm.
And so I ended up doing a residency for a year with this charity called Women at the Well, which is supporting women coming out of your exiting sex work, trafficking, and substance misuse.
Mhm.
And I remember talking to one of the ladies there, and she described it. She tried to describe to me. She was like, she goes, when I walk out of this, because it was the charity was like a base, we had like triage and everything else, did food, and I was doing like the arts program there and stuff while I was there with the ladies. But she said, you walk out of this building, you walk out into your world, and you go to the train station, you pop into the coffee shop and do things. She goes, I walk out of this world and I see everything differently. She said, I see where the gang lines are. I can see who's working, who's not. I can see who's trafficked, who's not. I can see the underworld that's
Mhm.
living there that you have no knowledge of and are completely naive of, and you would not know unless you lived my life or been someone that was a part of that life.
Mhm.
And to me, when she was describing this idea of this underworld that she lived in within, because this was in King's Cross in central London, it reminded me, it sent me right back actually to when I was in the Peruvian Amazon, and they were describing similar things of overworlds and underworlds being, a place of spirits, sometimes of ancestors, depending on the Amazonian belief system that you're talking about. And, I thought these worlds aren't dissimilar.
Mhm.
Like one, yes, you're in the Peruvian Amazon, it's this kind of archetype of nature. It's in, every kind of, David Attenborough documentary, nature
Mhm.
documentary, whatever it is. Like at some point there's going to be one in the Amazon, the same way that there's going to be one in like, on the life in the oceans, whatever it is.
Mhm.
But the natural world is not excluded outside of this kind of like this kind of the most supernatural kind of example that you have of kind of nature. It's also in the
Mhm.
way in which the worlds that people live and they go into and the way in which they're formed. And so that underworld that lady was talking about, is also one that's very, very real,
Mhm.
where in different time frames, for example, that world runs during the night and things, and you'd have, say, for example, like pimps and stuff come into the house, like calling women out of the house and stuff like that. And I just thought, these different worlds, although like, nature is a part of that, but these, the worlds that people build and they are a part of, or they find themselves within, are very, very real and intersect. So I don't think it's nature as being mutually exclusive necessarily. So because I think those systems of night and cold and weather and where you're able to find solace, even if it's like in a tiny little space down an alley somewhere, and you find yourself in a little kind of patch, which you do sometimes in London, or whether it's trying to get out of the rain under a tree or something, or by the side of a building or whatever, and
Mhm.
even the creatures that share our world in London, I think they're not dissimilar. But I think this idea of the worlds that people live in is one that's, I think, a key one for me, and what may be thriving or maybe deprived or degraded in those worlds, and also how they overlap. Because as she said, I did not see the world that she saw when she stepped out of that building. I stepped into another one, but our worlds they were pluriversal. They were overlaid over one of each other, and we were in the same space. We were but occupying completely different perspectives of
Mhm.
life and what it was to live.
This is
Does that make sense? I hope that
it
makes
makes
sense.
it makes perfect sense because it's almost like that lens of awareness that you when you're I always put it like this is you don't until your attention is drawn to something, you don't
Mm,
recognize that that something
yeah.
is there. But when your attention has been drawn to it, then you see it everywhere. Yeah.
It,
So
that project was one of the most humbling, I think.
yeah,
Yeah, like things like, some people having such challenges that like you need support to like, call the bank,
yeah.
or like, the idea of home.
Yeah.
being something that, you go home to your home, and, obviously people in, people having different circumstances, and, in terms of relationships and different things. But the fact that you may have a space that you can go in with your rent, if you've got a mortgage, whatever it is, and that's
Yeah.
yours. And many of these women were in sheltered accommodation. Some of them were homeless. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Hmm.
and the idea of the home was so fractured and things as well, because, you know, really, for many of the women, say for example, sexual abuse was extremely high in terms of their experiences,
Yeah.
and how they'd gone into sex work and things. Not to say that that's the case across the board, but in what was
Mhm.
happening in this circumstance, it was. And so the home was something that had been corrupted and degraded and was a place of abuse or of violence. But also, the dream was to have that where it was safe, and it was something that was loved, and it was cared for, and it was warm, and it was lit, and was a place of shelter. And that was the dream. People,
Mm.
women that had lost their children, for example, their children been taken away, and one day this dream of being reunited with them, or being able to keep your children.
Yeah.
So I think those are very humble kind of things. When I would go home, and I'd open my front door and I'd turn the light on, and I'd sit in my sitting room, and I'd just look around and be like, you realize how valuable that was, because actually I took it for granted, but it was an extremely precarious and difficult thing, and fragile thing to manage. But for many, it's like normalized, you don't think about it. But for others, it's something that's so precious that it just seems to slip through the fingers, really.
The part about it, again, it was about that sort of, the perception,
Mm.
or because we're perceiving the world in one way, but there are multiple ways, and it's how well we appreciate what we have. 'Cause-
Mm.
'cause I'm just thinking, because of the kind of like narratives which you've threaded together so beautifully so far. Um, how does this influence your artistic expression? How did you get into be I can see, I can actually feel how it is that you got in, but can you explain it to us, what it was
Yeah.
that gave you that drive, that energy, in this space?
So, I mean, it was something that naturally kind of one was like gifted with, but it's
Mhm.
something that from a child, it was just like, it was a natural proclivity. It just seemed something that I excelled in. And it was like, it was instinctual. I didn't have to think about it, it just connected, and it just made sense to me. So drawing, or anything kind of creative, really, it was like making jewelry, it was like textiles and stuff, whatever it was just something that I was just always drawn to. And it just seemed to be the way in which I seemed to negotiate and kind of represent and articulate my world really around me. I loved, for example, I loved to read. I love stories, so growing up, yeah, I read kind of voraciously, like a lot of the classics and stuff when I was in secondary school and things. And so, and I was in like Saturday classes, and summer school sometimes as well, around being in the Caribbean and things. So it just was this way that it just, everything that you're kind of absorbing and a part of and immersed in, then you want to be a conduit, and almost like kind of it to flow back out of you. And to that was in kind of creative kind of enterprise. And as I grew older, it was almost like I started shaping it really into this kind of process where I found myself like, there'd be subjects, or there'd be stories, or there'd be events, whatever it was that I'd have an interest in, that I'd find really fascinating. So that would almost become like a kind of like brief, if you like, almost like a key kind of question. And then to answer it, I would then like kind of research, and then I do like field work, and then through that, then you'd have the creative outcome would be almost like the answer to this question, if you like. So to give an example of that would be, um was okay. So for example, if I took the example of the Amazon, so with that residency, I was looking at the myths of the actual Amazon. So obviously Amazon and Amazonian culture, but the idea of the Amazon. So from like Wonder Woman, for example, in comics, to then look at the history actually when you looked at across like continental Africa and the tribes, and actually Amazonians were kind of like female warriors, for example. There were some
Mhm.
examples in, I wanted to say the Dahomey, is it the Dahomey? I want to say where because I used to collect like illustrated like natural history and children's books, like antique books and stuff. And so they're wonderful illustrations in them. And there was one where you had these female kind of warriors, and they had these kind of guns. So this is about like, I want to say like 19th century, but each gun had like cowrie shells on it. And the story that was being told about this, I think it was him actually. Um, the story about this um, of this particular incident and this person seeing these women was that some of the guns were completely covered in cowrie shells, other weren't, and they were one for every kind of kill, basically. So the women that had the rifles that were completely covered in cowrie shells were just these absolute militant kind of warriors that were first into battle. But this led back into like finding out mythologies and stories going back into like Mongolia, for example, into the steppes and stuff like that. So my initial premise for this was like looking at like this kind of conception of the Amazon as like as the Amazonian as in this female kind of archetype, and then seeing its history, and then try and exploring that then actually within the Amazon like environment and communities, and seeing where this kind of thread kind of goes basically, and how it's in its current
Mhm.
interpretation. So that was then so when I read a lot around kind of Amazonian kind of like belief systems, cosmologies, practices, like the use of, say, for example, psychedelics and different things, and how that fit in, like things like ayahuasca practices and stuff, and and how those kind of worlds kind of worked, as well as the kind of histories within that area. And then, to me, field work is the thing, or I call it field work in the sense that, I can do all the kind of, what can you say, like academic research in terms of reading and things and stuff I want to, but it's going into that space and then living it to see what it actually is, to see whether to contextualize what you're reading and what the initial
Mhm.
research is to what's happening then on the ground. And that's where the stories come out of it as well. So, for example, I didn't know Peru, where I was in that time, which was near Iquitos, that was like kind of the child sex capital at the time. So it was like, so there were women, there was lots of stories of girls being trafficked. There was things where, like domestic abuse and different things were also quite key there in terms of like use of alcohol and different things that were happening rurally. But you also had the dissemination and the degrading of like kind of indigenous rights and language, and like the tribal leader was trying to campaign and was doing his utmost to maintain their indigenous kind of belief systems, say, for example, within the Kukama community and their language. And this was one of the reasons we were brought in for the residency as well, was to share that and to create this international kind of working community space where we could share ideas, and so I brought my kind of Caribbean heritage to that.
Mhm.
But so that kind of, and then out of this room, so I keep like a lot of the time I keep like written audio, film, diaries, constantly collecting things, and probably doing like drawings and stuff as well, so visual diaries and things as well. And these kind of the stories that come out of that then will reveal themselves in a final outcome, which is what I've done in terms of this Creative Connections project as well. So then that led to exhibiting in the Fine Arts Museum in the capital of Lima, and then also at the local contemporary arts space that just opened in Iquitos at that time. I think this was back in 2017. So that narrative of being able to use kind of creative expression structurally to kind of explore key kind of questions, environments, people, practices, to uncover kind of whether those are narratives of um in terms of like, whether that's exploring narratives or understanding conceptions of whether that's racial justice, environmental justice, social justice, whether that's kind of understanding just the way in which people live and the experiences people have there, and also your own in terms of evolving your own kind of understanding, because obviously a lot of these things are kind of can be like culture shocks at the very minimum, but a lot of the time are quite
Mhm.
um interpersonal kind of evolutions as well. So I find that this kind of structure helped me to kind of define and understand different worlds, different places, different times. But each time you then do another project and another project, you're adding another strand of kind of like intelligence
Mhm.
and evolution to what you're doing. So it builds upon itself. It's a kind of like cyclical
Mhm.
evolution in your work. So you're getting better each time in terms of the practice,
Mhm.
but your understanding is broadening as well, or kind of, all the time. It comes back, I think, back to those kind of roots of exploring two, growing up and exploring two different worlds, really. Just
Mhm.
that curiosity and that hunger for that never ends.
Yeah, it's because it sounds to me that, as you said, you're building on each.
Mm,
The experience doesn't stop when you're no longer in that locality, as it were.
Mm.
Physically, yes, it may stop, but actually, when you go on to the next project, you'll bring in some of that lens w- into that new space. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
and
definitely.
and that's helping to uncover, because I'm just thinking about that the creative process which you're describing, in that actually it takes a considerable amount of research
Mm.
and breadth of research to kind of like scratch below the surface of
Mm.
what's the visible. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I always think of it, I don't know if this is the right analogy, but I always think of it, you know, when you think of like comics, right? When you've got like a
Yeah,
multiverse. So I mean,
yeah,
like, you know, like Miles Morales now, you have like Spider-Man and things, and you've got
yeah,
all these different Spider-Men, you know what I mean? All these different worlds are occupying all these different kind of narratives and storylines, but they intersect and overlay one another.
yeah.
That's kind of what I think sometimes that I'm doing with my practice is like for every project, you know, a new character, a new protagonist kind of created probably many times a different kind of you know, iteration of myself because I'm
Yeah,
changing going into this space. So like that
yeah,
world's kind of built, opened, explored, you know what I mean? But once
yeah,
it's opened and it stays that way, it continues to
yeah,
live. And then, you know, if each project is a different world, you know, a different aspect of this multiverse that's like built and open till they are kind of overlaying of each other. And that will continue to build as long as I practice. And all of these different protagonists that you have, these different iterations of me in these different worlds, all are
hmm,
interlinked, all intersect. But you know, I'm a
hmm,
different person every time I'm going into those things because their experience changes you. You don't
hmm,
you get where you've been and what you've been a part of, and then that carries into the next world. Because I think
hmm.
that's also one of the things that you know that could be quite confusing and complex about those kind of understandings in comics is that because the knowledge is shared, it's not kind of siloed and then it only stays in this one world that's opened. You know, the different
Hmm.
Spider-Men kind of interact with each other and get to know each other, and they have different qualities of personalities and different, you know, powers, if you like. So that's
Yeah.
the way I kind of think about it. It's lots of iterations of yourself and it's growing and multiplying each time. That might be a little bit, I might have gone off piece with that a little bit, but
No, no,
that's
no,
the best way sometimes I can explore it. It's like comic, I love comics, so
yeah.
yeah, and graphic novels and stuff. So that, yeah.
No, I figured that. There was a couple of things which you said there about that whole kind of like multiverse and whatever else. But
Mm,
underneath, another thing which has come to the fore is the impact on female issues.
mm,
Uh, I think, and how many times females seem to be the ones who are much more connected to the natural world. I don't know, maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but the way in which you've described it, it's from a female lens that much of the work which you've kind of like described seems to be coming from. Am I, has that been a common theme, or is it just?
it might be, I'd hesitate to say necessarily to gender it. It may be the case that I think, you know, and it's in many cases because of the kind of familial roles that women take in many cases,
Mhm,
caregiving roles and things, that to have
mhm,
an understanding and empathy with the environment that you're in, obviously it
mhm,
impacts the way in which you're able to care for your family or your
mhm,
children or your community or whatever it is. Um, I mean, from what I've kind of what I've kind of seen is that they can be, well, it depends on the community, the society of the community, obviously historic as well, that historically as
mhm,
well, that kind of factor. But I think it depends on the roles in which, you know, men and women or different genders may take within that society as well, because obviously, you know, um, depending on different societies and things, you know, you might not just have the binary of like male and female as well, you know, you have
mhm,
different things like that. So I think it's the capacity by which one, how a community and society may define the way in which different roles may be assigned within a community so that they
mhm,
enjoy the natural world. But then I also think it's on the individual as well in terms of like how you choose to engage
mhm,
that. I know, and maybe
mhm,
fulfill that role or walk away from it or more, you know, and a
mhm,
bit of both, you know. So I think it's both. I mean, the as I said, I've seen men in very kind of strong, you know, leadership kind of roles, especially in terms of being able to navigate like the natural world and stuff. I think especially again, like just with the like Hukama, I think with the men going out doing the hunting, you know, kind of reconnaissance and looking at, you know, and going into like the rainforest and stuff. And I was in the Amazon because obviously, you know, the Amazon. where they were. One, you've got things like loggers and stuff, so you've got like illegal logging, you've got things like, for example, mining, so you've got loads of like, kind of chemical pollution that's going out, things like mercury and stuff. I mean, you can, we were trekking in like primary rainforest, for like 2, 3 days, and you'd be walking and it's like pristine, you're having to hack your way through, and then you'll just find a space that's like the size of 5 football pitches that's just completely gone. But you've also got, say, for
Mm.
example, you've got cartels, you've got trafficking moving, so the rainforest, the jungle is somewhere that hides a lot of illegal practices, as well as those of you maybe going in, as well as, say, for example, tourism and
Hmm.
logical, environmental. So, it actually becomes a place where a lot of people actually are intersecting across one another. So what I read as well is like, men, also fishermen, if you're talking the Amazon, because obviously, talking about rainforests that are half flooded with rivers
Hmm.
sometimes. So, being able to not just navigate that, but then I think also predators as well,
Hmm.
whether you're talking about piranhas or anaconda or anything else. So I think, I did see quite a lot where you had male roles for that, because they, seeing that they were stronger and able to go in, then the women were the caregivers kind of thing.
Hmm.
So I saw that, I've seen that a fair amount, but but that's not to say that the women didn't also
Hmm.
engage. But I think just in those kind of capacities, I saw that kind of lot. So I think maybe it's also kind of a security and care aspect, um, as well, and being able to survive. You
Hmm.
know,
So I'm just wary of time.
yeah.
Right? Um, I'm going to ask you a little bit about the exhibition that you're doing at Imperial, how you
Mhm.
came to get involved, and what has, without kind of like spilling all the beans, as it were, because we want people to come and see it.
Yeah.
But but what have been some of the lessons which you have learned throughout this process yourself?
So the Creative Connections project, which I'll speak kind of like softly about. Yeah, I applied for the position as facilitator and as an artist, as we, as that was working with the archives here at Imperial, so the 1851 Royal Commission, and the Imperial College archives. And then there's also, workshops that were going to be led as well, which was very attractive. But I think as well, when I was researching the opportunity, I read about the history group, and
Hmm.
I read the reports and things that came out of it. And so to me, I thought there was a very clear and interesting kind of foundation as to how this project like had its origins, and how it was trying to evolve what seemed like a dialogue or a conversation or an intention in terms of looking at different histories. And going through this, and like the different participants that I've worked with, looking at the archives and things, and the works that's come out of it, I think it's like, it's been a huge, I think every project is, it feels like, but this has been a huge learning curve. I think, one, so I'm coming from an arts and humanities background, so I'm coming into a STEM institution, so it's a very different way of kind of culture and working and different things. And I think so in like Imperial, not only in terms of its history and where it comes from, say from the 1851 exhibition, because the legacy of that, of the Great Exhibition of All Nations, the legacy of that is what gave the funding for what we see as the South Kensington estate as a
Yeah.
culture and exhibition, culture and education kind of centre. So, and that, and Imperial is a part of that legacy. But I also think it's meeting, I think, like in the workshops, but also from researching like the student journals and reading, articles from like, from like 1914, 1913, throughout the World War One and World War Two, into the late 1940s, early 1950s. You see this kind of, this long line of like voices of people, conducting research. But I think in the journals, it's really interesting. What I find about it is the personal that comes out there. Because it's not like a research journal, it's a student journal. So people
Hmm.
also are putting forward their own thoughts and their own experiences and things within and as part of the research. So they were very kind of, I thought they were quite personal in terms of research statements, actually. And then, you're listening to people's voices now in the workshops and hearing people's different experiences. And it's like the things that people are working on, like the research that people are doing now, that has been going as a part of this institution, and what that's feeding into, like the international kind of, you know, outcomes and influence that has, and how wide ranging that is. And then if you think of Imperial as like, it's from the top 10 universities in the world, I mean, that's quite, that's an incredible thing when you have these group of people and they're talking about lots of different experiences, but also how their lived experience and their heritage and different things come into it. So I think it's been really interesting from that point of view. It's a very different kind of context for me working in a university and do that kind of participatory work, I think. Um, and then yeah, I think there's so many voices from your past that are in your institution. But I also really respect, and I think one of the key things that attracted me throughout the project, and it's kind of stayed with me, is the commitment to the intention to continue the conversation. So, you know,
Mhm.
obviously what fed into the history project, but continuing those conversations and like with your different networks and things that you have, like people's voices and what they share and things. Like I really respect and admire that the commitment to continuing those conversations and those and that dialogue, because it's, you know, this one and done idea is you know that you can have, you know, you can hear all over the place sometimes in many different spheres. It's, you know, you can't answer collectively such vast and difficult questions and histories
Mhm.
in one project or in one session. I'm not claiming to have done that in this one because it's impossible for me to do that. I can't talk
Yeah.
about, you know, 175 years of history and then, you know, contemporary imperial kind of communities in one artwork. I mean, that's not possible. But I
Mhm.
think but seeing it as an evolution in a conversation, in a dialogue, in an understanding and learning, I think then, you know, I think that commitment to something like that is really admirable and it should be recognized. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I'm I'm really eager to see what you've produced because we've been
Oh
discussing
God.
and I've seen glimpses of some of the other stuff which you've done, which is really quite amazing. And how does it feel for you then, knowing that and I'm going to say across the world,
Mhm.
you've got a body of artwork which you have created or helped to reinterpret and to deliver. How does that make you feel about your place in this on this little mortal coil that we have? And you know,
Honestly, I feel like it's premature for me to answer. When I'm 85, maybe I can tell you how I feel about that. Because I do get quite shy in things about the things that I've done. Also because they always feel like such personal adventures for each project that, you know, I sometimes I get shy and I think, oh gosh, you know, it's just kind of me in these explorations. You know, you wonder if they're going to resonate with anyone. And it's, you know, as an artist and you put your work out, you know, whether it's a museum, whether it's a gallery, whether in this case it's like, you know, at
Mhm,
Imperial, you know, you always have your kind of like, you feel like you have your heart on your sleeve to a certain extent, but the work's going to go where it is, whether people like it or don't like it. I mean, you know, it's not really someone's kind of, whether they're attracted to it or feel it or not necessarily. It's whether like it raises kind of questions or conversation is the key
mhm,
thing really that I think you're trying to do and open the stories. And it's also, I like to think, a kind of recognition of other voices and things as well that maybe may not have been heard as much that you can surface. So there's a kind of service, maybe in some ways to the ancestral, some to those that have passed, as well as to like kind of contemporary voices or things that you've seen that maybe other people may not have had the opportunity to see that you have seen, you know.
mhm,
But I think it's, you know, yeah, it's a difficult one to answer. Sometimes when I look back in my files and things, and I look at the amount of projects I've done, I'm like, oh my God, we've done quite a lot. We've been to quite a few places and we've done quite a lot of things. But to
yeah,
me, what stands out in my head is like I see faces and I see
mhm,
places. You know what I mean?
mhm,
It's like when you have
mhm,
memories of like family things, when you look back, it's just like I think that's what that's I it may be weird to think, but I really remember the project by the final outcome. It's like
mhm,
I'll have like almost like a kind of slideshow of like people, places, events that happened that fed into it. Do you know what I
yeah,
mean? And
yeah,
I probably recall those quite a lot in different projects because I'll see the similarities that may have happened in this one with these
mhm,
people that or this
mhm.
environment that I see somewhere else. So it's a hard one to answer.
No worries, no worries. That's fine. I'm going to ask my final two questions
Go
then,
on then.
right? Which is the first one is Um, what advice would you, well, you know what, in this whole conversation, we haven't really gone through your educational experience or anything like that,
Okay.
but it doesn't matter, right? What advice would you have given to your younger self, that child that was running through the fields in Barbados and in Sussex. What advice would you have given to them? And then the other part of the question is, what do you think that they would look at you now and say, wow?
Okay, so in regards to the first half of the question, if I was brutally honest, what I would say to a younger self would be just like, you're gonna need to hold fast because the world's like it's in, incredibly intimidating, and
Mm,
life's gonna be very hard and it's gonna be very, very challenging. And I think, being brutally honest, there's been extremely hard lessons. I mean, I talk about these projects and different things you practice, but you're a human that's going through these kind of things as well as within a family and within a community. And
mhm,
there are so many challenges. I think if you have like, I would say what I have as an artist, it was like a calling, it's like a vocation. I don't feel
mhm,
necessarily, I've even tried to walk away from it like a couple of times because I get so frustrated of being so kind of associated with being this kind of artistic person that it felt like it made me like one dimensional. So there was times like in my early 20s and stuff that I walked away from it because I just felt like I was being like restricted by it. But then I'd always come back to it. But I think I'd say to my younger self, you've got to, when you have your vision, you have your calling, the commitment to that vision is kind of everything. And I think it also can surface a lot of things because there's a lot of, you know, people that you think are the closest ones to you that may be supportive are actually kind of maybe your biggest detractors and your biggest challenges. It's going into these different environments and things where you're actually going to be scared out of your mind, but doing it anyway. I think fear is a massive thing that I would say to my younger self, that the different faces of fear that you may feel and find yourself in, having the courage to overcome them and move through anyway, and continually striving, even when it feels like the steps are so tiny, so incremental that you don't feel like you're ever getting anywhere.
mhm,
Maintaining that persistence and maintaining that is everything, and you will start to flourish in
mhm,
that vision. So I think that's just kind of like hold fast really and hold to your faith in who you are. And then the
mhm,
other part of the question where I would say if they were to look at me now, I'd be like, oh, um, I'd probably say, if they were to look at me now, I don't know, my younger self looking at me now, I'm not sure what they would say. I would say like, like I've survived and I'd like to think I've thrived and I did what I said what that we were going to do. And I've maintained it. And it goes from strength to strength. And I can't believe like, I wake up some day and I pinch myself because it's just like, I can't believe that this is what I get to do. It's my job. It pays my mortgage. It provides the food for my son on the table.
mhm,
It's
mhm,
that to me is the art world is extremely hyper competitive. So it's very difficult, and it's really underfunded. So it's really, that's a point of pride. Um, what they would think, I think maybe I would say to them, don't tell me, hold it to yourself because I don't know if I don't know if I could take it if I failed you, and if you're happy with it, I don't know if I could take the compliment. Do you know what I mean?
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
let's see what it looks like at the end of the story, and then like I'll give you like the biggest comic book you've ever seen, and you can see all the adventures that we've done, and you can look at it from there.
You know what? That's really interesting how you describe that because it's almost like you're saying my life is an exhibition which isn't yet complete. And so
Mm,
I don't want to do the full reveal until I
yeah,
get to that end stage.
yeah,
It's a work in progress, so we can't reveal what we're going to do until the work is complete.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. But there's always, I don't see the commitment to the vision
yeah,
ever changing. I think that's the thing with
yeah,
recording, like whether you've made it
yeah,
or not, it would always
yeah.
be present. So I think that's the thing. And it's given me more in my life that I ever could have hoped for, in the
Mhm,
darkest kind of times and places, you know, my practice has been the thing that's grounded me. It's given me a sense of belonging, a sense of identity that was so rooted that then when things in my life events, crises in my life, or going into these places where, I haven't been to the Amazon before, I haven't been to like Sierra Leone before, different places, you know what I mean? Or working with women where you're in these situations and you're hearing like, stories about some of the terrible things that things have been through, it's shocking to the system.
mm,
You weren't born to be naturally resilient in the face
mm,
of so much kind of danger and challenge and stuff. So, you have to evolve and you have to adapt, and you grow resilience.
mm,
It's not some kind of like, genetic predisposition. I think you may have a little
mm,
bit of that, but
mm,
you've got to evolve it as a
mm,
skill set. So I think I think it's everything to kind of who you are, and to have that passion, because I think it is one of the biggest ways that you can absorb kind of crisis, have moments of like radical joy and stuff, because you know what it is to kind of to fight for those things, and then they correspond and they return back to the self, back to that sense of identity, which then only flourishes more. I think it's like, what is it, Alice Walker, like the book In Our Mother's Gardens, and she talks of this idea where the community and the women that she knew and she grew up with had so much spiritual um power and things like flowing out of them from the culture, that they had like these thraves of like spiritual waste. And I think that's a really, so when they were, when you're talking about, well, she was talking about, yes, economically may have been deprived, but culturally we were so rich, we were so wealthy, our spirituality kind of like was this waste among us, because it just overflowed out of who we were. And I think that's the thing with I think that can be the thing with identity and belonging,
mm,
in the face of challenge, but in the face of like, success and joy. It's the thing that can root you and enable you in the storm, in the hurricane, but it's also the thing that, can overflow within you to the point where, it feeds into everything you'll do, into your value system, into how you, into your ethics, into, you know, ideas of sustainability, however you are and how you take it forward. So I think it's incredibly important to maintain that passion or that vision that you
mm,
have.
mm.
That makes
Fantastic.
sense.
It does. It does. It's really deep, but it does make sense, you know. Um, I just want to say a big thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. I'm off to the framers after this, so I'm going to like
Yeah.
see other artworks coming along now. It's been like
No,
stretched and printed and stuff. So,
listen, I can't. You see, you can see all of this, and I'm just there. So I'm knocking at the door, going, "Please, let me have a look. Unveil that curtain just a little
oh
bit."
wait. Well, I'm hoping you like it. I'm hoping you do.
I think I will.
Yeah. Well, thank you for inviting me. This has been really nice today. I really appreciate it.
No, it's amazing. You are amazing, and whatever wherever the natural world takes you, right? Um, then I know that you're going to be connecting with it, and
Mm,
that's the most important thing, is maintaining that connection and allowing yourself to be expressive within that natural world. I think is a key
yeah.
element. You
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It roots me. It's
Yeah.
grounding. It's enriching
Yeah.
at this point.
Definitely.
Mm.
So I'm going to just share with the audience and say another big thank you, but share with the audience um, what we're going to be doing next week, or who's going to be our guest next week. So our guest next week will be Barbara Adewumi, and she is the BMA Staff Network co-chair, and she's also part of the Partnership for Developmental Office and a postdoctoral, sorry, research assistant at the University of Kent, focusing on student success as one of her EDI projects. So she'll be here next week from 12:30 till 1:30. And if you have missed any of the previous interviews, then please go to our YouTube channel, which is tinyurl.com/belonging IAO. And you'll be able to see we've done over 200 guests now. So it's a massive collection. Virtually anything that you can think about, then somebody's probably spoken about it. So please go and have a look and see what lessons about belonging we can learn. But as I said, none of this would ever be possible if it wasn't for the fact that we have so many people who have shared their stories of belonging, who have told us what it is that's helped them to gain their identity. And so over this weekend, where we're celebrating, or some people will be celebrating Valentine's and other things, always know that first and foremost, you do belong. and it don't need other people to validate you to say that you belong. So keep
Absolutely.
searching for belonging, and we will see you very, very soon. So thanks very much, and have a good rest of the week.